Hi, good morning. My name is Anupinder Singh, and thank you very much for joining for this particular webinar, which we are actually starting with a series of the mentoring sessions on C++. For this particular session, I thought of interacting with the students who are preparing for their placements. Like in last couple of weeks, you might have faced a lot of challenge for getting your placement calls or maybe getting any offers and something like that. But maybe you can utilize this time for the purpose of your preparation. So that's something which I believe we can do together. And moreover, before we start with the session, I just wanted to tell you we have planned this series in terms of 10 different webinars. And apart from that, we will be only considering on the points that, okay, what is the programming language in terms of C++? What are the different constructs it has? With the add-on point of that, what could be the possible things that can be asked during the placement process? Because this C++ is a foundation programming language in terms of object-oriented concepts that any of the interviewers may ask you, right, very specifically. Because if you are not aware about the other programming language, then this is one programming language they will be going to ask about thing. Now, it's not at all like limited to the people who are preparing for the placements. If you have first year students, second year students, third year students wants to have a proficiency in C++, then this is the session you can start with, or the series is all open for that. So you can go through that particular series of the lectures I have already given in the description. You can go through the dates. Only Sundays and Fridays we are going to have off. Otherwise, every day 11 o'clock we are going to have these particular session. Now, one thing I want from your side, like we have a comment section available here. I think the chat is available, right? So you can comment in the chat in case if you find any kind of challenge when we are interacting in terms of audio, in terms of video. Your feedback is accepted. The session will be divided into three different sections, we can say. First one is we are going to pitch for what the topic is. Second is we are going to have a complete discussion around that particular topic. Because for this, if I talk about this lecture, the agenda for this lecture is we are going to talk about what is the basic structure of the program. Second, we are going to talk about what type of compiler we are using, how this compiler is going to work around. Third, we are going to talk about that what are the specific data types or variables or identifiers which are being defined by using the C++ language. So this is what is the agenda for this particular webinar, and that's the first section. We are going to introduce that particular part. Second, we are going to have a detailed discussion about the topic, and third, in the last part, we are going to take your questions. So you can put your queries in the comment, and throughout the webinar you can put. And in case if we feel like that the query is supposed to be addressed at the same time, then it will be addressed immediately. If it can be pushed to the end of the webinar, it will be done in that last part, right? So can anyone confirm me that is my audio and video is okay, so that we can start with the session? Maybe in the meantime you do it, I can basically start. All right, so as this is this live thing is new for me as well, so I'm also learning, so please help me do that as well, so that the quality I should be able to maintain and we should be able to interact in a qualitative way. So, all right. So let's start with the session. I will be using a kind of board, which is a Microsoft whiteboard, which I'm going to use for the description part. And apart from that, also just to remind you that this session will be recorded, right? So if by any chance you missed it, you can actually watch it on my YouTube channel as well as on my Facebook page. Oh, great. Deepika has confirmed that audio and video both are good. Thank you very much, Deepika, for confirming. So let's start with the C++ part. So generally, whenever we are going to study any of the programming language, so this programming language, we know this is for the purpose of working through the computers, right? So C++ is one of the oldest object-oriented programming language, which has been designed out of C. I always say it is designed out of C because a lot of construct has been picked up from the C, right? So the only addition which has been done to C++, the major addition corresponding to the object-oriented part is the classes, right? Classes construct has been included into the C++, and apart from that, certain more you can say standard library has been added. Specifically, ANSI C++ standard defined a lot of different changes into this particular programming language. So from where this C++ construct was included, it was included from the Simula 67, right? So this is the language at that particular point of time when object oriented has started becoming popular, right? It allows us to have a more hierarchical structure instead of procedural part, right? It allows us more flexibility in terms of defining our variables and all that stuff, right? So let's first start with by understanding that what is the basic program structure corresponding to this particular language. So I have board here with me. So if we look at the particular part, so whenever I'm writing a particular C++ program, I will be writing. We have include, and that include will contain the IO stream, right? So this is what we have in terms of the very first part. So this, we call this particular thing as a preprocessor. So let me complete the program first, just to have the complete discussion. So we have int, we have main, and then we have a curly braces, and then we go for the std and putting a very specific dot. So this is the standard construct we are having. Then this is the basic cout statement, and then we have the insertion operator. And apart here, what you can do is you can simply type any of the text, text, right? So this is what I have. And then finally, we will be writing return 0. And then we have a curly braces, right? So this is what is the basic construct. And this construct contains basically how many instructions? There are 6 instructions which are being provided. So this particular instruction is a preprocessor, right? It's a preprocessor, right? This is a main method, right? So when I say method, it's a function basically. So any C++ program that will start its execution from the main method only. So you write anything, but you have to write this particular main function so that it can be called, right? So I may use method or function, vice versa, okay? And then what we have is we have a particular cout instruction. This is used for putting an output on a particular output screen, right? So it could be a printer or it could be a monitor, right? Not printer, it's only monitor, right? So next what we have is the return statement. So return contains 0 and then colon, right? So this 0 is why we are having a 0 here, because we have an integer at this particular place. So anything which you have a return type for the function, you have to return the similar type of that particular value. Now return is a statement which you have to write if you are returning any of the thing from that particular function. So overall, a very basic C++ program, in case if you are considering for the procedural part as well. So you are writing an include statement, you are writing a IO stream file, which is a header file. We call this particular instruction as a preprocessor instruction. Then we have a function, which is a main function for the execution is going to get started. And then we have certain within the curly braces of that particular function, we call it a body. This particular section is a body of the function. This body is going to have certain instructions. Right now, because the function is also giving us a return type, the return statement is supposed to be included. Otherwise, your program or your compiler is going to give you an error or warning corresponding to your particular execution step. Right now, this structure is the pretty basic and is similar to what we have in C language. Right, the only difference is that instead of stdio.h, you are writing iostream in the very first line. That is the preprocessor part. Okay, so when we are aware of this particular part, there are two more things which you may know or may see in a program. That is the comment with either the backslash part, or you are going to have something which is included into the backslash and the asterisk part. Right. So this is one type of comment, and this is another type of comment. So you write a double slashes, that is for the single line, whereas this is used for the multiple line. Right. So why we are considering this comment part? Now, whenever we are in a interview, right, and if somebody asks us to write a particular program, either in C, or whatever, we have to take care of certain things, right? So first thing is that what are the different kind of what syntax we are writing, that should be correct. That's the very first point. Second point is that because we are writing a program, we need to also mention that what particular identifier we'll be discussing about the identifier at the end of this particular session as well. So whenever we are writing any identifier, for what purpose that identifier is going to get used, right? So how you're going to convey it to the other person, by using the single line comment or by using the multi-line comment. So how it can be done? So simply, let's say if I'm writing a particular program again, so I'll be quick on writing this program, right? So we have hash include iostream, then we have int main, right? And here I'm going to write this function is for start of execution, right? And then I have curly braces started. I am going to write std colon, and then I'm going to write cout. These are the comments, and semicolon. This is very important, semicolon at the end of the line, and then return 0. And here, if I can start writing the multi-line comment, so I've started the slash forward slash, and then what you have the asterisk, and this is a multi-line comment, right? And then we have a streak. Now, what's the difference? We have a multi-line here, and for this particular part, we have a single line comment. I'm just considering this as a single line for you, right? Because I may not be able to go forward in the screen. So this is how the comment can define about my particular program. Now, if somebody is going to read about it, they will be able to know that, okay, what purpose I'm writing this particular program for. So we will be going forward in this series. We will be looking at a lot of different kind of programs, and I will be writing the comments corresponding to that particular part. Now, why I have emphasized this particular part in the very first minute of this the webinar and in the first series of episode in this particular webinar. So the reason is that if we start with the good practices, it will persist in our habits, right? So that's very, very, very important. Creating a habit of writing the comments in in the particular program is very, very important, because later at the time when you go and join in any company, you will find out that they will ask you to do a lot of documentation of your code, and it's quite difficult for a new programmer to get used to that particular part. Also, if you are trying to contribute to the open source communities, open source projects, this thing is very important, right? So with with C++ series, you can start building this particular habit, and that can actually help you out in terms of considering the good practices for the particular coding part. So that's the structure of the program. Now there is one thing which you should have noticed, is that we have to generally in C++ we write C out. And then why I'm using this std colon, now double colons. Now if you have studied some of the concept of C++, this colon is basically a scope operator, okay? And this std is basically a namespace, right? So namespace actually is being introduced by NSI C++ standard, and it actually defines the scope of the identifier that can be used inside a particular program. So cout here is an identifier, right? So that's the very first thing you should consider as an identifier. Now it's a keyword also. Any keyword can be identifier, right? Any function name can be identifier. So main is also an identifier here, int is also an identifier here, but it's a keyword. Okay, so anything which may define a specific type of element in a programming language is actually spoken as a identifier, right? So we'll also look into the identifiers in detail, but right now you can consider that. So whenever an identifier is to be used and it is defined in certain programming language construct, and it is being defined under a package or a namespace, then it should be given the reference to that. So this standard std, which is named as standard namespace, it contains the definition for cout, cin, insertion operators, extraction operators, and all that stuff. So standard is supposed to be used with the cout. Now if I wanted to avoid this thing, then I have to use this namespace on the top of the program, and this top of the program can define something like this. So I'm writing the whole process again. So include iostream, that's the same line, right? Then we are going to have a using keyword, using namespace keyword, right? And then I'm going to use, now s is small here, std, and then semicolon is there. Now semicolon in C++ is very important. Any instruction which is going to do some kind of operation is going to have a semicolon at the end of that particular instruction. So please mind this semicolon to put everywhere wherever it is required. Then we have int, we have main function, and then we have simple cout text can be printed, and the semicolon is done. Then we have return 0, and then it has been done. Now if you notice, now we have directly used cout here, because we have already included the scope of the cout by having this particular instruction using namespace std. So there are a lot of different kind of namespaces which are available in C++. You can utilize them for the purpose of introducing the scope inside the C++ program, the current C++ program which you are considering to work around. So this is one of the most important concept in C++. Generally people ask in the programming based interviews that why we use these namespaces, why this is being considered, what is the scope, why the identifier cannot be used without including this namespace, or without mentioning that namespace along with that particular identifier, right? Let's say if I miss this particular instruction, this particular instruction, then what will happen to the identifiers that are being used inside that particular program. So all that questions are basically been fired by the interviewer towards the student, right? So understanding the logic behind these instructions will actually allows you to give a very correct or pinpointed answer to the interviewer. So that's very, very important to have in consideration when you are learning a new programming language. It's not only the C++, it could be a Python, it could be a Java, it could be any another programming language which you might be considering. So three things with the viewpoint of what you call the interview. The very first thing is that the program structure which you are writing, you should be aware about why that structure and what is the basic division of that structure is. Second, you should be putting the comments wherever it is applicable, where you need to actually tell the other person that why you are considering that particular part, specifically while writing a particular program, right? By using any IDE or by using any computer system, right? Third thing, you should be aware about that what are the preprocessors or what are the namespaces which are required for that particular program, and why they are considered in that way. What are the different identifiers which are being associated with them? So this is where the things comes in the picture, corresponding to that particular part, right? So let's consider the next part, because we have already looked at the structure which is relevant to the procedural part. Now another structure which we have in C++ is, because we mentioned, very specifically mentioned, that C++ is different from C in terms of added constructor of the construct of the class, right? So how it has been considered correspondingly. So again, I'm writing a couple of lines repetitively. So I'm going to write include IOStream, right? So this is what instruction it is. It's a preprocessor. Then we are going to have using namespace, right? Using namespace. Which namespace we are using? We are using a standard namespace, right? Semicolon is to be put. Now the construct comes for the C++ based classes. So we are going to define a class, and that class will be defined by using a class name. Okay, and then we are going to have a curly braces started on that. So this is where the C++ actually is going to get started. Now next thing is, because we need to have certain members in that, so I'm just writing. If you are not aware about this int and whatever I'm writing here, please ignore. We will be discussing it in the second half of this particular webinar. So int, then we may have, let's say, some number. It's a variable or identifier, you can say. Then we have float, and float could be, let's say, cost we are considering. And then there is another thing I'm writing. This is called as public. I'm writing a colon here. And then what we are considering here is a function void get data, maybe some more int b void put data, and maybe I'm putting a void here, and then we are closing the curly braces and things are done. Okay, now this is the actual structure of an object-oriented based C++ program, right? I've written it a bit partially still. So if I do the basic segregation, so this section is basically what? This section is a preprocessor section, right? Here what we are going to get started with is a class declaration, right? This section is basically the member variables. This section is member functions, right? And this is where the declaration of the class is going to get stopped. Okay, so our basic C++ class is going to have this particular structure. So preprocessor is given at the top, then we have a class declaration started, then we have a member variables, then we have a member function. The curly braces starts with the declaration and curly braces stops here. So every thing which is written inside this particular curly braces will be a member of the class. Now, if it is a function, it's a member function. If it is a variable, it's a member variable, right? This is basically an access modifier. So every individual C++ class will have an access modifier. We will be talking about this access modifier a bit later, but this access modifier actually defines that how this member function or member variable can be accessed when we are referring to this particular class, right? So this is the basic structure that we have corresponding to a particular C++ based class. Okay, now because we need to use this class in this in certain kind of program, so every class that we have will be always followed by a main method, right? So we have int main method, and the class will be referenced in that particular main method. So we will be studying that particular thing in 6th or 7th webinar, right? Or maybe earlier, maybe fifth webinar, we are going to consider that particular part. But this is the structure again we have for our C++. So C++ can also have the procedural structure of the program can also, and definitely it will have a C++ based class object oriented structure for its particular part. So this is the two set of structures which are there in C++. You are working on a very simple program. You go for the previous one. You are working on object oriented based program. You should be looking into this particular structure in a very detailed manner. So every class will have every program will have definitely a preprocessor statements. Then there will be a main method. Definitely it will be there because the execution is going to get started from there. And the class definition, and that class declaration and definition that contains the member function and member variables. So variables are something which are going to store some value, and functions are something which are going to work around that particular values which are being stored into that particular system, right? So this is what you have in terms of your structure of the program. Now we know the program is being written in a particular ID, or maybe written in a particular notepad. It is supposed to be executed, and the execution is actually going to get done only when the compilation of that particular program has been successfully completed, right? So what we have is, so I consider this particular thing as a, let's say I have a program, right, which is written in a C++. We have already seen the structure of that particular program. Now we are going to send it for the execution part, right? So I want to execute that particular program. So if I want to execute that program, there are two sub steps in that particular part. So we know we have hash include at the top, right? That's an instruction. We also have a using instruction on the top, right? So both these instructions are going to go under the preprocessor, right? So preprocessor is a particular entity which is going to first screen the program and see that what are the different components which this program is using, and they are supposed to be included in this particular program so that the scope can be generated. Okay, so preprocessor plays a very important role. So whatever we are including, let's say IO stream we are including, and we are including a namespace which is a std. So preprocessor will go through all those things, get the code of all these preprocessors and club them inside the program so that the compilation can be done successfully. So once this particular program plus the code from the preprocessors is being included for the compilation process, the things will be sent to the compiler, right? So compiler will have both preprocessed elements and the program, and the compilation will be done. So once the compilation will be done, a .exe file will be generated, right? So whatever the name of the program, .exe file will be generated, and that will be executed. So it's an executable file basically. So generally when you are using GCC compiler, it may also give you another file as well, that is obj, right? So there are two files which are being generated. One is the executable, one is the object file, right? So both these files have their own significance. So whenever we are doing a compilation, this compiler is going to generate a very specific machine code which can be put into the execution when you double click on that particular program. So you need to understand one very important thing here, that whenever this compiler is being programmed, this compiler is actually going to work for the machine on which it is being installed. Now we generally have two type of machines which we know, x86 and x64, right? So what's the basic difference? It's a 32-bit machine, and it's a 64-bit machine, right? So this is basic difference here. Now my compiler, if it is installed on a x86 machine, that means it is going to generate me a particular machine code which is based on 32 bits, right? And this basically defines the architecture of your computer system, okay? And whereas if the compiler is installed on this 64-bit, then this is going to work around that 64-bit based architecture, right? So this is very specific. So sometimes you might have noticed that your IDE may be working with the 32-bit, but it is not compatible with 64-bit system. Turbo C++ is one of the typical example for this particular part. Turbo C++, you cannot use it on the 64-bit machine. You have to do a wraparound for that, and then you can run it. There are ways to do it, but still directly you cannot run it. Why? Because the compiler is not able to process the program and compile it for the underlying architecture. So it's very important to understand. So compilers are very specific. So it's not only C++, it's C, it's Java, it's Python. So compilers are very specific, corresponding to what they do in terms of generating the machine code. Even if you talk about Java is actually first converted into the intermediate code, and then it will be passed on to the JVM so that it can be converted into the underlying architecture based machine language. So understand this thing, whenever you are writing a program, that is going to be compiled and will be executed in terms of machine language only, right? So that machine language is nothing, it's an assembly language or maybe any instruction set specific to that. So you might have studied the computer architecture, right? So computer architecture is actually defining this particular section, right? So you are actually defining that how the computer is going to take the instruction and how it is going to get executed. But who is going to tell the high level language to get converted into the low level language? That is the compiler. So compiler is a very important tool. You might have studied a complete subject around it. There are 7 steps which are being followed for doing all that compilation process. So there are a lot of different kind of analysis that happen, a lot of different kind of code optimization happen inside of these compilers. So you can go through that. It has its own scope. So maybe later in some future time, we may do a webinar corresponding to that, webinar series corresponding to that compiler part. So this is the basic process. So compiler is something which is very important. Compiler gives you the machine code which can be executable directly on a particular instruction set or a particular architecture based system, right? So 32-bit, 64-bit, this is what you have the generic part, okay, are generally available for you. So that is what you get in terms of the compiler, right? So that's one of the most important concept. If you want, we can do the detailed part in the end of the webinar series corresponding to this, right? So that's what your compiler is. Now let's move on to the another section, and that section is basically the variables and data types. So we have covered the basic structure of the C++. Now we have covered the compiler, and at last we are considering our variables, and we are going to consider our data type. Now, before we go and get into these things, I'm not going to miss this particular part. We call it as a identifier. Now, what exactly is an identifier? If you have studied a lot of programming language, if you are in 4th year, you might have studied at least 3 programming languages. One is C, one is C++, and one is the Python. If your college or university administrates that course. So identifiers are basically the names which are being used inside the programming language. So these names can be the variable, these names can be the function, the array, the class, the interface, the namespace, anything. So any particular set of characters, if it identifies a particular operation or if it identifies a particular component in the programming language, that's an identifier. Now, when we are working with the identifiers, there are certain rules which are being defined, just like C programming language. So the very first rule is that identifier can consist of alphabets. They can consist of digits. They can consist of underscore, right? So this is what we have: alphabets, digits, and underscore. They are the key characters which can be used. Second rule for this is that any of the identifier cannot start with a digit, right? So digit is not allowed as a first character. So example could be like, if I'm writing test 9, let me write it correctly. I'm just learning with this tablet. Test underscore 9. So this is a valid identifier name. If I write 9 underscore test, it is not at all a valid identifier name, whereas this is the valid identifier. I can also write it as test underscore 9. So I have a capital letter here and I have a small letter here. So both of these things are treated as different in C programming language. So third rule is that the uppercase and the lowercase, okay, so they both are distinct in C language, in C as well as C++ language. And last and the most important part, any keyword cannot be defined as a variable name. Keyword cannot be given to a variable name, right? So let's say if I have example int, I cannot write int. So this is a type and this is a variable name, right? So this thing is wrong. We cannot do that. So int is a keyword in C++ programming language. So int cannot be used as a variable name or identifier name, whatever you wanted to call it. Now, whenever we are trying to work around this particular part, so there is one very specific nomenclature that has been utilized by the industry when you are writing or when you are working on projects, right, or in a team. So we call it as a name conventions. So name conventions are of two types. One is Pascal name conventions and one is Camel name conventions, right? So there are two types. So Pascal is wherever anything that starts with capital letter, right? So let's say if I give you an example. So I'm writing test underscore 9, right? So this is something I call as Pascal. Another example is test var. So this is capital, this is capital. Test var name. So this is capital, and this is capital. Okay. And then for the camel casing, we have test _9. So this is a small. Then I write test var. So this is small character, this is capital character. So anything which starts with the small character followed by the capital character for the adjoining words. So this comes as a particular camel casing part. And if I write further, test var name, right? So this is a small character, and capital character for the adjoining word. So this is the camel casing correspondingly. So we use different kind of casing for defining different kind of identifiers. And if I call the if I give you examples, so generally classes are always Pascal cased, whereas the variables are camel cased. Anything which is defined constant is Pascal case. Anything which is defined as final is Pascal case. So all that stuff happens correspondingly as per your type of identifier that you wanted to define in the system, define in a particular project. So that's what you get in terms of your naming convention corresponding to your identifiers. Now, next thing we need to consider one more important thing, because identifiers are supposed to be saved or are used with the data type, right? So C++ programming language, because we are working with the data within the program, so we need to have certain data types for defining that particular part. So when you call the data type, so C++ contains the data types like character, right? Then we have a numerical data, numerical integer data, right? Apart from that, we also have floating point data, right? And again, we have another one that is Boolean. Apart from that, we have a void. Apart from this, the final one, we have a null pointer, which is generally being defined as this null. Okay, so these are some of the built-in data types of the C++ programming language. The very first one is the character, second is the integer, third is the floating point, fourth is the Boolean, fifth is void, and then we have a null pointer. So here, apart from this, because we have a subsections corresponding to our data types, so you can define a particular data type as a unsigned, and you can also define it as a signed, right? So these two are unsigned and signed data types which we have. If we are working with the numerical data, it could be a short, it could be long. There are two more types which are being defined. So integer can be short integer, integer can be a long integer, integer can be a long integer. Similarly, float can be a long float, float can be a short float, all that stuff. So what exactly the short and long defines, and what exactly this signed and unsigned is going to define us, we are going to look at that particular part in a short while. We should also consider this Boolean. So true and false, these are the two values that we have for this particular data type. Void is when we are not having any type. Now it's like there is no type defined for that particular identifier. So anything which has no type can be defined as void. And null pointer is when we are pointing toward no memory address, that gives us a null pointer type. Okay, so that's the important thing which we have corresponding to the particular type of data. Now, important part which we need to consider here is when we are working with this particular data types. So let me scroll for that. So we know that there are certain limits for any of the particular variables. So let's say if I'm writing a particular, or you say it as we are declaring a particular variable. So I will be starting with a type, right? And I will be writing the identifier, and that will be followed by some value, right? So if I am writing this particular section, this is basically initialization, right? Whereas this particular section is only declaration, right? So if we are using only this particular part of this instruction, then we are declaring only. If we are passing on the values, we are actually initializing that particular variable. So example could be int, I call it number equals to 10. So this is initialization of a number variable, right? Now, when we say initialization of a number variable, so that means certain memory will be allocated and the value will be stored in that particular memory. Okay. So what defines that with what type of value it is? So it's the data type. Now, integer can be basically of a couple of types. So 8-bit integer, 16-bit integer, 32-bit integer, right? Now this 16-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, or maximum it could be 64-bit as per the programming language notation. Now, how we decide on this, that which particular bit is going to consider for that particular part, and what could be the maximum and minimum values that we have, right? So when we are looking at this particular prospect, so let's say I'm considering an example that we are going to store an integer value with the 8-bit. Okay, so here what generally happens is whenever you store a particular value in a particular memory, it has been stored in binary number, right? So this 10 will be actually converted into binary. So we know that 10 is basically 1010. And because it's 8 bits, so 4 zeros will be added onto the front of that particular number. Okay. So when you are writing this particular part, so I'm considering 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay. So here the value will be 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, and 1, 0. So this is how it has been stored in the memory. Now, how do I know what is the maximum and minimum value that can be stored in this particular part? So I'm considering this particular value as a unsigned because we have not considered plus or minus for this. So here the minimum value that we can store is 0. I need to know what is the maximum value that we can store here because it's 8 bits. So that means 2 raised to power 0, 2 raised to power 1, 2 raised to power 2, 2 raised to power 3, 2 raised to power 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? So that means the maximum value which can be stored, I'm not considering these bits right now. So maximum value can be 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8 plus 16 plus 32 plus 64 and plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and this is for the power 2.2 raised to power 7, that is 128. So the maximum value that we can store is 255. So this is how your range has been defined, that what is the maximum value in terms of unsigned integers or unsigned characters you can store. So even if you talk about the char is basically 8-bit, 1 byte. Okay, this is 1 byte, this is 2 byte, 3 byte, and 4 byte. So if we are considering this particular stuff, so this is the reason why if we are using integer as a 16-bit, 2 bytes, and unsigned, the maximum value will be 65k, right? So you can do the calculation correspondingly that particular prospect. Okay, so this defines the range, right? Now, if I'm considering it as a unsigned, so let me do the calculation again for you. So if I'm considering it unsigned, so when you are considering the unsigned part, so what you are telling the machine is, signed part. So in case of signed, the MSB will be considered as signed. So 0 defines positive sign, 1 defines negative sign, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So I'm writing 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So I've written the decimal 10 as a binary part. Okay. So here, because we are considering this particular bit as a sign, so that means the value can only be stored in the 7 bits. Okay. So what we have here is the value that means 2 raised to power 0, 2 raised to power 1, 2 raised to power 2, 2 raised to power 3, 2 raised to power 4, 2 raised to power 5, and 2 raised to power 6. 64 plus 32 plus 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is somewhere around 127. Okay. Whereas when you go in the negative part, it will be 128 that will be stored. So the range in this particular section is minus 128 to plus 127. So this is how you define the range for your particular data type. Great. So now you are able to appreciate that why this signed and unsigned has a difference in their ranges. Okay. So this is where the during the placement interviews, the interviewer asks that, okay, why signed and why unsigned? What is the basic significance, right? What could be the possible performance issues corresponding to this? What is the underlying memory allocation corresponding to unsigned and signed, right? So that all set of questions can be answered by using this particular thing. So we know what is the maximum value, what is the minimum value corresponding to it, and we can actually do some calculations regarding that. What is the range of the values that we are considering for a particular data type and for a particular variable when we are considering it for the particular part. Now you remember the Gangnam Style song, which surpassed the maximum number of views on the YouTube, right? So that was one of the typical example that what was the limit for their maximum views and how it surpassed it, and how what typical engineering problem it brought to the team of the Google corresponding to that, right? So this could be the possible example which you can share with your interviewer while giving the answer to such questions. So this is typically what you need to consider while learning a programming language. So why this data type, why this value, why this range, how the memory management is going to happening behind this code, and how exactly this data type will behave in the future interactions of the user. All that stuff you have to take care about. And one of the most important for any programming language which you are learning, right? So this is the most important factor which you should always consider, right? So this is the typical consideration for the built-in data types. Now we know we have a built-in data types. We have, apart from these, some of the derived data types as well. So what are the derived data types? Derived data types are basically arrays. Let me use another pen. So they are arrays. They are functions, right? They are pointers. Apart from that, you have references and so on. Similarly, apart from this, you have a user-defined data types. Now, what are user-defined data types? User-defined data types are, if you have studied C language, structure is the user-defined data types, what you have in C++. Union is another one. The difference they have is only the memory. References, what they get for their variables. Then class is a user-defined data type. We'll be studying this thing in very much detail. And then we have enumerators, right? Enumerators is another type which we have in terms of user-defined types. So we will be looking at these derived types and user defined types in upcoming webinars when we are going to discuss by using certain programs. So in upcoming webinars, I will be using the code block or dev C++ as an IDE for the explanation purpose, because now the basic concepts we have the clarity. We know how the particular data type is working out, what is their limits. We know what are the different types they have, with the integer, short, long, or what sort of memory allocations they are going to get. We also know that they could be a signed integer or unsigned integer. There could be long or short values. There could be floating point values. There could be Boolean values, void type values, null references. So Boolean, void, and null. Once we start with our practice with the code and during the webinars, we will be using them, and I will be talking about them in during that particular point of time. So we know what sort of identifiers we have, what are the different rules corresponding to it. We know what are the naming conventions we have, Pascal and Camel, and why they are important in the industry. Because when we are working in a team, we have to be very specific with our naming conventions. We know that what are the different structures of the program and how they are being compiled on with respect to their architectures. By this particular part, we know what is the structure of our class based C++. We know what is the basic procedure that we have for our particular what you call the program type in the basic C++ program. So we have all that stuff listed out here. So we started with the basic structure, and now we went towards the data types and the variables that we have. So all these things are typically the base building blocks for your programming language, right? So for C++, it is. If you are considering any other programming language, you should always look at these particular prospects at the very first place, so that you should be able to understand that what is this programming language working around, and what is the effectiveness of that particular programming language. So this is one of the most important thing for your learning. So that brings us to the end of this particular webinar. So time is almost 12:05, and the house is open for your queries now. You can, if you have any queries, you can type in. Let me see what you have posted for your queries. So I start with the Invalid says. So he says, Vaheguru Ji ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji ki Fateh. Same to you, buddy. And then Manju Pandit. Oh my God. So Manju Pandit has written, why are you so dirty? Oh, I am so dirty. I have no answer for that. I'm sorry for that. And then and again, we got a question from the username which comes as invalid. I'm not sure why you do not want to show your name. Anyways, the question says, to enable code review team member to focus on more important issues than understanding whether a particular identifier refers to a function name or class or variable, etc. Yeah, definitely. The focus can be, but we are starting with the basic part, so that's why I refer to that particular thing. I think that is what you wanted to point me out. So we will be definitely looking at all those things in our upcoming webinars. I think that we can do definitely. So there is no doubt in that. We will be covering a couple of things in the next set of webinars, right? So I think that's it for the question. So I think we are done with our questions. Anyone who wants to type in their questions, I am waiting for another 2 minutes. And first of all, thank you very much for, okay, opened an error, leave it. Okay, right. So anyway, so first thing, like, thank you very much for joining in for this particular webinar. I know this is pretty basic thing which we have started with, but still I believe this is important when you are starting with a new programming language, or maybe if you have started during your engineering, but you have done it only for the purpose of clearing the exam. But now, because when you're sitting for the placements and when you're sitting for the interviews, then you have to consider a lot of other factors as well. So it's very important to understand the basic concepts that are there for the building block of any programming language. So we started with this. So next, again, we are going to touch upon the basics. We will be looking around some of the further concepts where we talk about the input-output instructions, how it can be done, what are the different operators which are there, what are the different ways we can format our output, what are the different kind of constants or literals that we can define. So all that stuff we will be discussing in the upcoming webinar, which is on Monday, 11 o'clock. You may subscribe to my channel and specifically press that bell icon so that you get a notification whenever I go live, or whenever a new webinar is scheduled, or whenever a new video is being uploaded onto this particular channel. So apart from this, you can connect with me at my handle on Twitter, which is @Anupinder. You may also connect with me on my email address, which is hello@superwits.com. You can connect with me through that as well. So I've just displayed it here on the screen, so you can go through that in case if you want any specific kind of query answered correspondingly. You can also join us on our Telegram channel. So Telegram channel I have, just give me a minute, I can share that link as well. So in case if you have not joined our Telegram channel, you can join on that. Oh, oops, it has been shared directly. Great. So you can also join us on our Telegram channel at this particular link. So this is like kind of direct link which you can join into the channel, and a lot of updates I post over there for the upcoming webinars and relevant stuff. So I also answer queries in terms of FAQs. I generate a blog corresponding to that. So in case if you have any queries which you send on hello@superwits.com, I'll definitely compile them as FAQ as well. I'll be sending you a personal reply too. So I think that's it for this particular webinar. At last, thank you very much for joining in for this particular live webinar series. Hope to see you on Monday, 11 o'clock webinar as well. And we'll be discussing a few more concepts on basics of programming language, like literals, constants, the insights on how input and output is being utilized in C++ programming language, and how they can be formatted in a effective way, right? So with that, thank you very much for joining in. Good day. Stay home. Stay safe. Thank you.